In today's video, I'll be talking about the 3 reasons why I believe the Minnesota Vikings could win the NFC North. Subscribe and like the video if you do go on to enjoy. Let's hop into it. So we are going to begin with my very first reason, and that reason is going to be the roster is unbelievably loaded. Now, in this section, I do want to talk about what they did in the offseason as well as in the draft, and then we'll talk about what their depth chart looks like today. As you can see, this is what they did in free agency, signing Will Fries to a 5-year deal, Jonathan Allen to a 3-year deal, Ryan Kelly to a 2-year deal, Isaiah Rodgers 2 years, Javon Hargraves 2 years, Jeff Okudah, Rondell Moore, Tavier Thomas, and a handful of other players too. They also made an awesome trade for Jordan Mason. They traded Ed Ingram, they released center Garrett Bradbury, and they re-signed a handful of very important players. Me personally, I think this is arguably one of the best free agency hauls of the free agent cycle. This is not a Vikings team last year that had a lot of major needs, but they had a couple issues they really wanted to get sorted out. For starters, the interior of the offensive line last year really struggled with, a couple injuries with the tackles, with some injuries here and there, and just underperformance. It was probably the biggest reason why we saw Sam Darnold kind of take a big step back. But now you add in a Will Fries, who has been a proven guy, can do everything. He's just such a smart and gifted player, and I think he fits so perfectly with like any system, especially the Kevin O'Connell system. Bringing in Ryan Kelly, a veteran, a bit of an older guy, again, kind of like Will Fries, who Will Fries is a little bit younger, but for Ryan Kelly's sake, he is a little bit older, but man, he can still absolutely ball. He's an awesome center, one of the best in the league. You went from having a really poor interior offensive line to truly like 2 awesome players who ironically both came from the Colts, now wearing the white and purple. I think it's just going to be an awesome fix up here with this offensive line. Like, those pieces were massive. Granted, some big deals, 5 years, $88 million for Will Fries. Actually, a pretty solid contract, all things considered. And for Ryan Kelly's 2-year, $18, obviously a lot of money, but I think they're both easily worth it. Then the Jonathan Allen pickup. Now, admittedly speaking, Jonathan Allen is not the Jonathan Allen that he used to be, but he's still a very capable and quality player that is fine in run support and also can get to the quarterback here and there. This was an interior for Minnesota on the defensive line that wasn't necessarily horrific or anything like that, but definitely could have used a bit more juice up there. Jonathan Allen, kind of like Ryan Kelly, is a little bit older, maybe isn't the same guy that he was like 3 to 4 or 5 years ago, but still is a very quality role player that can get the job done. He may not be all pro or Pro Bowl, but frankly, the Minnesota Vikings really don't need that. In addition to Jonathan Allen, they also brought in Javon Hargrave. Now, Javon is an interesting player because obviously just a few years ago with the Philadelphia Eagles, he was incredible, like a huge part of that interior defensive line for Philly. Went to San Francisco, and I just don't think he ever really played up to really his potential, and maybe that was a scheme issue. Maybe that was just Javon Hargrave having a hard time adapting to that roster and with that team. I'm not necessarily banking on Javon Hargrave being a, former version of himself, because at this stage of his career, with him getting a little bit older, I don't know if he has the same level of juice or same level of, flexibility and movability. But it's a 2-year deal. It is worth a lot of money, but I think it's a fairly okay bet to make. When you have a rookie quarterback on a cheap ass contract like JJ McCarthy has, you can kind of get away with handing out a little bit more risky deals. And I think Javon Hargrave, it being a 2-year deal, isn't terribly risky, and it could have potential long-term benefits. Isaiah Rodgers on a 2-year deal. This is a secondary for Minnesota, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail here in a second, that I do think has some issues. Isaiah Rodgers is a guy who's been there, done that, has been in the league for quite some time. Has never really been like a full stop cornerback 1 anywhere, but he has been a reliable role player, rotational guy that's gotten spot starts and has been there, done that. So I think Isaiah Rodgers was a nice pickup. So just right there, those 5 pickups, the moral of the story is that you're getting guys who have been there, who have done that, and have been really good players wherever they have been at. So for all those pickups, to me, they all get a big thumbs up, and I think they really do make this roster a lot better. Some of the other signings, like Rondell Moore, could be potentially like your wide receiver 3. We'll wait and see on that one. Jeff Okudah could be a rotational corner. He's had some good moments here and there. And I think re-signing Byron Murphy was a big deal. Re-signing Harrison Smith was also a big deal. Of course, it wasn't all rainbows and sunshines. Cameron Bynum did leave the team. He was a massive part of this defense where he could just create a lot of turnovers. So that one did suck, but I mean, for the most part, I like the re-signing of Aaron Jones. You extend Theo Jackson, trading for Jordan Mason, who had a lot of good plays last year for San Francisco. Clearly, they wanted to stick with Christian McCaffrey, so they made the move to get off Jordan Mason. Frankly, I think that at this stage of McCaffrey's career, I probably would have just kept Jordan Mason to be the future guy. But for Minnesota, a team that has an older running back and Aaron Jones, who has a lot of tread on those tires, bringing in somebody younger like Jordan Mason to play behind him could be an awesome pickup that who knows, maybe this year could be a huge impactful guy for this team. But then we get to their draft, and they have 5 picks, so there's really not a lot to talk about here. Most of these guys will not be huge impactful guys, but Donovan Jackson could potentially be their starting guard. He can also play tackle. I think he's way better suited as a guard, though. Ty Felton, bit of a skinny, undersized receiver, but he has some juice. He's a pretty solid route runner. We'll see if he can maybe forge a role for himself. Maybe he could be your long-term replacement if Addison leaves. Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, rotational defensive lineman. We'll see if he can get some run this year. Kobe King is a solid player, but I think for now, probably be a bit more special teams, depth option. And Gavin Bartholomew, we'll see if he can carve a role for himself. Obviously, only 5 picks here, so not a ton to talk about, but I just thought with what they did in free agency, they did not need an incredible draft. They just needed a solid draft, get a couple role players, get some, quick fixes here and there. That's kind of what they did. We'll begin by just briefly covering some of these picks. For Donovan Jackson, I think he'll be your starting guard of the long-term future. I think he's an awesome player. He had versatility with Ohio State to play guard and tackle. Again, as I mentioned a bit earlier, I think he's better suited playing in the interior, but he has that flexibility to kind of play whatever you need him to play. He was super reliable for Ohio State, and I think for Minnesota, you're just getting somebody who is reliable, and that's obviously what this team wanted. Ty Felton, again, I don't know if he'll really be an impactful guy year one, but he could potentially be a bit of like a long-term project that could end up paying dividends. The rest of the guys, again, as I mentioned earlier, special teams, rotational guys. We'll see if maybe some of these guys could even make the team. Most of them will probably be on practice squads, and you never know. There could be a guy who comes out later in the draft and ends up really working out. All in all, their draft was solid. It wasn't a huge impactful draft. I thought I got the job done. But now we look at the depth chart with this team, and as I mentioned earlier, this roster is just straight up loaded. There is really no major problems with any position on this team. JJ McCarthy, who we'll talk about here in a second, Aaron Jones, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Jalen Naylor, Rondell Moore, Ty Felton as your backup receivers. We'll see if those guys can get some playing time. TJ Hawkinson, Josh Oliver, CJ Ham. Your offensive line is super dominant, and there's some solid depth options here too. Defensively speaking, not a ton of major holes. Jonathan Allen, Harrison Phillips, Javon Hargrave, Jonathan Grenard. You, of course, obviously are hoping for Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave to play up to, their contracts. We'll wait and see there, though. Blake Cashman, Andre Van Ginkel, just so many, movable pieces that all get the job done. The one question mark I still kind of have with this team, and I understand that maybe I'm blowing it out of proportion a little bit. I don't think it's a major problem by no means, but I do think it's maybe a bit of a small concern. I think that is the cornerback group. Isaiah Rodgers has never really been a true reliable cornerback one ever. So for him to be in a situation where maybe he has to play a bit higher than, what he has lately, I think it could end up being a bit of an issue. We'll wait and see. Mekhi Blackman has shown glimpses in the past. We'll wait and see there. Byron Murphy, superstar, really good player in the nickel. He can also play just all around the field. Harrison Smith, Josh Metellus. We'd like to see maybe a bit more proven depth here in the safety room, but especially with Harrison Smith being a little bit older, maybe you could have went with a long-term replacement there. All in all, though, it's a damn good roster. Let us now move over to my second reason why I think this team is going to be potentially winning the NFC North, and that is that JJ McCarthy is set up for success. Now, as I mentioned earlier about this roster, it is an unbelievably talented roster and frankly just does not have a ton of holes. What we focus on the offensive side here, you have a superstar in Justin Jefferson, one of the better wide receiver in twos in Jordan Addison. Awesome running back duo with Jordan Mason and Aaron Jones that can kind of provide some different things. You also have some guys who have a level of experience in Sam Howell and Brett Rypien. Obviously, Sam Howell started for the Commanders, has been in the league for a few years, so he can kind of help guide him through his young rookie, I guess, quote-unquote rookie season. You also have TJ Hawkinson, who's been in the league for quite some time. This offensive line is a bunch of veterans who have, as I mentioned way earlier, been there, have done that, they know what they're doing, and they can really help JJ McCarthy just straight up be successful in his rookie season. Beyond the actual experience of this unit, you also got a number of guys who are just awesome players. This is one of the best offensive lines out there, one of the best receiving cores out there, an awesome tight end room, some great running backs. It's an offense that's damn complete. And then on top of already all the experience and all the great pieces on this offense, Kevin O'Connell is one of the best coaches out there. Now, I know some people might think he's a bit overrated because he hasn't really had the playoff success quite yet. But frankly, I think maybe this team has been, in some ways, potentially overperforming, given what their rosters have been and given who their quarterbacks have been. With this team now, with Kevin O'Connell having his guy at quarterback, having this awesome roster around him, I think this is the year where Kevin O'Connell can really put his stamp on this team and what their future looks like, because he's gotten this team so far in the the regular season. He just needs to kind of put it together in the playoffs. And if there was ever a year where this team could really go all in and make that big playoff push with a new quarterback, with their awesome head coach, I think it's this year. This is in my opinion, and maybe I'm wrong here, Vikings fans, you can tell me. This is probably the best roster that Minnesota has had in like quite some time. And frankly, if this team had a bit more of a proven quarterback, like if this team had, I don't know, like a Kirk Cousins, of course, prime Kirk Cousins, I think a lot of people would have a lot more nicer things to say about Minnesota. Like I've seen a lot of people talk about how Minnesota is going to be disappointed this year because they don't trust JJ McCarthy. But I look at this team and I look at this talent. It is one of the best teams out there, just straight up talent wise. I understand you're trusting a rookie quarterback, and I keep saying rookie. He's technically not a rookie, but it's his rookie season and all things considered. I know it's hard to trust those guys, but man, I trust JJ McCarthy. I thought he was a pretty solid recruit. His game is just perfect for Minnesota. And I think the biggest thing for me is, as I mentioned, the pressure is not on JJ McCarthy to be Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen. His pressure is just to be a cog in the machine. He just needs to get the ball out on time. Don't throw picks. Play with some anticipation. Run the ball when he needs to. Play within the system. He doesn't really have to be Superman. He doesn't have to be Lamar. He doesn't have to be Josh Allen. He doesn't have to be those guys. And because the roster is so loaded around him and he has such a great coaching staff, I feel like it's going to be very difficult for JJ to not succeed unless he's just, frankly, not it. Now, again, I don't want to put the pressure on JJ to be perfect. He's going to make mistakes. He's going to have some games where he struggles, some tough matchups, and I think that's the one thing that makes me pause a little bit about them making a deep playoff run, because you have to expect at some point JJ to make some mistakes. But again, he just needs to be a cog in the machine. He just has to get the job done, and if he can be that guy, man, this team is going to be set up nicely. Let us go ahead and move over to my third reason why I think the Minnesota Vikings can win the NFC North. The NFC North is frankly vulnerable right now. Let's go through every single team and some of the question marks these teams have. Obviously, we'll start with Minnesota. Their biggest question mark is just JJ McCarthy. If JJ McCarthy is awesome, Minnesota is going to be a damn force to reckon with in this division. For the Chicago Bears, yes, I love what they did this offseason. Caleb Williams had a fine rookie season, not perfect, but I think he got a lot of the mistakes out of his system. Ben Johnson comes in there. The roster is loaded with talent. They had such a solid draft, such a solid free agency. They're great. However, it's the Chicago Bears. They have done this before where they put together these awesome free agency classes and it hasn't quite worked out. You have a young quarterback, a young head coach who is very inexperienced. And in general, you're asking a lot of players to build chemistry very early on. And if that chemistry is not there early on and Caleb struggles and Ben Johnson is adapting to being a head coach, you can see the Chicago Bears maybe not live up to the lofty expectations that many people have for them. Again, I want to reiterate, I do think Chicago is a damn force to reckon with. I think they're so loaded with talent and have so many good pieces. And if you believe in Caleb Williams, then you have to believe that Chicago will be a force. But there's a lot of question marks with their team. Then there's the Green Bay Packers. They're one of the more complete teams out there. They remind me a lot of Minnesota in a lot of ways, but they're not quite as talented as Minnesota. The one thing that Green Bay does have over Minnesota is a somewhat proven quarterback in Jordan Love. I say somewhat because he's only played like 2 years, and I think he's shown highs and lows, but clearly he's more experienced than JJ. Now, my biggest question mark for Green Bay is because they also had a super aggressive free agency, there is going to be some continuity problems here and there. I think you're also asking a lot of Matthew Golden to instantly step in and be a big-time contributor, and the secondary for Green Bay, frankly, it could be their Achilles heel. When they got rid of Jair Alexander, he was one of the few cornerbacks on this team that had some faith in when he was healthy. Outside of him, there's a lot of question marks on this team. I think there's also question marks about what does this team look like if they even make the playoffs, because frankly, they've been there before and they've had some good runs, but they also had some disappointing runs. We'll wait and see. I think Green Bay is a good roster. I think they definitely have a chance, but there are a lot of question marks surrounding the receiving core, the secondary, and a handful of other position groups that make me feel a little bit concerned for Green Bay. And then lastly, for the Detroit Lions, clearly they were the best team in this division last year. They beat Minnesota to ultimately win the division. Then, of course, they had the bummer game against Washington in the playoffs. My whole thought process with Detroit, I still think they're a damn good team. I still think they're probably the favorites to win the division. However, new OC, new DC, your starting center just retired, and you're relying so heavily on Aiden Hutchinson, who's coming off I want to say broken leg, to be your go-to pass rusher. Because outside of him, they don't really have any great pass rushers off the edge. So a lot of question marks with Detroit. And frankly, when you look at Detroit's schedule, it's a very difficult schedule. I know that the entire NFC North has some tough schedules, but Detroit specifically has a really brutal schedule with a lot of tough games. Of course, some gimme games here and there, but a lot of tough ones too. Minnesota could take advantage of some of the early potential season struggles for Detroit as they're adjusting to a new OC and a new DC. What Detroit kind of reminds me of in some ways, and don't take this out of context, I'm not saying they're going to be a terrific or a horrific team next year, but they remind me of that Eagles team when they lost Shane Steichen and they lost Jonathan Gannon. They lost both those guys, and then the next year they had two horrific coordinators, and that team just went downhill so badly in the second half of that season, and by the end of it, they were out in like I think the first round. I kind of worry about that with Detroit. Now, I still feel pretty confident in their coaches, and I still feel confident in the roster, but let's say the OC and the DC are not as good as the past ones. We could see a world where potentially the Lions take a bit of a dip down. So all in all, yes, the NFC North is still loaded with talent. There's a lot of good teams in this division with a lot of young talent, some older talent. It's probably one of the best divisions out there. But there's now some newfound questions that could allow a team like Minnesota to jump over them and be the better teams. So all in all, what do I expect from the Minnesota Vikings? I think they're going to be great next year. And I think hopefully these three reasons all potentially come true, because if they do come true, you could see a world where Minnesota really makes a big jump next year to ultimately win the division. JJ McCarthy has great success already built for him, great roster, great coaching staff, and the NFC North, frankly, is kind of vulnerable. But y'all let me know in the comment section below, how many games will the Minnesota Vikings win next year, and can they win the division? Let me know down below, and I love you guys. Peace.